back to what we're talking about. We've been talking about being divergent, and we want to keep reinforcing our vision that we are for Coffee County, and these messages are designed to do that. We talked about in the very beginning that we are called to follow a person, Jesus Christ, not a religion. So we're not following rules, rituals, ideas. We're following a person. And so that is divergent from every other religion in the world, including what is known as Christianity. And I asked my son, who is a senior at Valdosta State, who heard that first sermon, I said, do people at your school, how do people view Christianity? And he said exactly the way you described it. They view it as a religion. They view it as a political stance. They view it in the way that you described it. And so what I want to say to you is I'm not against the word Christian. Actually, that word's only used 3 times in the New Testament. And it was actually mentioned in saying that these people are followers of Christ. But that's lost some of its meaning in our culture. So we want to say that let's follow a person. Let's follow Jesus Christ and move away from religion to following a person. And those are 2 different things. They diverge from each other. And so what we encourage you to do over the last couple of weeks are read the Gospels. If you're not familiar with those terms, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the 4 first letters, Bible books in the New Testament. So we want you to read those because we believe that if you don't know what Jesus said, and you can't see what he did, then it's going to be very difficult for you to follow him. And so if you're ignorant of that, we want you to grow in your knowledge of what Jesus said and did, and that will help you to follow him. And so one of the things that I love about Jesus is that his stories, the things that he said, the things that he did were so divergent from the way that we normally live our lives. And so I love divergent stories. So let me see if I can get us on the ramp to where we're going today. I love to hear stories about people who do the right thing, they do the good thing, and then I like to take those and examine myself. In other words, give you a story back in the day. When I was at seminary, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary. One of my best friends there was a guy named Grant. And Grant and I were really close, but we were really different. And one of the ways we were different is I'm 5'6", he's about 6'6". And so it was obvious that we were physically different. He's very tall, I'm very short. And so we had that. But we had in common a lot of things, like we were both doing youth ministry. Well, Grant worked at a church called Northwest Bible Church, and he told me one Sunday afternoon about his experience in going to church. He said that he was on his way, driving his car, and just so you know, at this time when we were at seminary, I don't know what it's like to be at seminary now, but I imagine that anybody who's doing school is usually fairly poor, meaning they don't have a lot of money. At least I didn't have a lot of money. Grant didn't have a lot of money. So he was on his way to school in his beat-up old car, and not on the way to school, on the way to church, and on the way, he sees this guy on the side of the road who's homeless. And it's a very cold morning, and so he's driving by, and he senses that the Lord was saying to him, I want you to stop your car, go over to that guy, and I want you to give him your leather jacket. And so he drove by the guy, and then he began to hear the Lord speak to him. And so what he told me he did is he turned his car around, and he went back to this guy, and he took off his leather jacket and gave him the jacket, knowing that he didn't have money to go get another jacket immediately. So he gave the guy his jacket. So the guy takes the jacket and he puts on the jacket. You know how when you try on something to see if it fits, you stretch your arms out. So he's stretching his arms out. And Grant said, he said, man, this is a perfect fit. That God had moved him to do that. So when he told me that story, I thought to myself this. I was like, I wonder if I would have done that. Because part of that story is for me to examine myself to say, one, would I have ever thought about doing that? And if the Lord said that to me, would I be obedient to do that? And I was really struggling with the fact that I don't know if I would have done it. And that's just being honest. I don't know if I would have stopped. I don't know if I would have turned around. If I would have kept going and said, well, I've already passed the guy. If I turn around, he's not going to be there, and found some excuse not to. But what I love about that story is so divergent because Grant, he went out of his way to do what the Lord had called him to do, and he gave his jacket away. And I love stories like that. I love to be challenged like that. To leave the way I normally do things, to do it the way that I think Jesus would do things. I mean, Jesus spoke about this in the Sermon on the Mount. So if somebody asks you for your coat, give him your shirt. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Jesus would do. If you don't know much about Jesus, you know that he was giving, he was loving, he was serving, he was accepting. So if I'm going to follow him, I've got to leave my own way, I've got to leave the world's way, and I got to start following the Lord's way. And that's what today is about. So where we want to start today is in Romans chapter 12. Now, if you're here and you don't know much about the Bible, let me kind of catch you up where Romans chapter 12, because Romans chapter 12 is toward the end of Paul, the Apostle Paul. This guy got saved. Jesus met him on a road. Long story short, he started following Jesus. He was trying to kill people who followed Jesus, and then he started following Jesus himself, and then he started planting churches all around the world, especially in the community with the Gentiles. So therefore, he's writing to Romans who have decided that they would follow Jesus. And so in his writing, the interesting thing about Romans is the first 11 chapters of his letter to these Romans has no command. In other words, he doesn't tell them to do anything in the first 11 chapters. The very first command you get in Romans is chapter 12, verse 1. And that's where we're going to start today. But the important part about Romans 1 through 11, it talks about what God has done to save sinners. It talks about the fact that God sent his son to die for sinners like you and I. It talks about how God it justifies people by faith and not by works. And so the writing of Paul is to lay down in the first 11 chapters, this is what we believe. Because anytime Paul writes, he always talks about beliefs before he talks about behaviors. Because what Paul knows about all of us is that our beliefs will shape our behaviors. In other words, our works come from what we have faith in and what we believe about God and what he has done for us. So as he writes to challenge them, everything he writes from basically chapter 12 down is about practically living out what we say we believe. And so there's a turn in that beginning of chapter 12, and I want to read it to you because I think it's important for us. Here's what he says. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers. In other words, I implore you, I beg you, I'm asking you to listen closely. This is like I'm pouring my heart out because of what I said. Therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship, is spiritual worship. In other words, so Paul writes, he says, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to think about what Christ has done for you, what God has done for you in Jesus Christ. And what did Jesus Christ do for you? He died for your sins. He rose again. So think about what he's done. He's paid for your sin. He's defeated death. I want you to think about that and how it impacts your life. So in view of that, this is how you should deal with your body. He says, so you should offer yourself as a living sacrifice. In other words, Jesus died for me. He doesn't require me to die for him. You don't have to pay God back for what he's done. You just have to come up and say, because of what you've done, I'm willing for you to use my life. That's what Paul's saying. It's really simple. I've seen what you've done for me. I can't pay you back, but I want you to know, God, that just like the Jews would make offerings to the Lord, one of them was a burnt offering and it was an offering of devotion and commitment to say, I'm giving all of my life to you, so use my life. And so Paul says, this is how we should live in light of what Jesus has done for us. And then he says this, and this is where we want to land. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So what he says is, I want you to not be conformed, so don't be conformed to the world, but I want you to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So here's what Paul's getting at. Because of what Jesus has done, because of what God sent his son to do for you and I, How should we live? We should present ourselves with 100% devotion to him. And then secondly, we need to stop being conformed to the way the world thinks and the way the world does and start being transformed into a brand new way, a divergent way, a different way, a new way. And so here's what he says. He says, don't be conformed. That word conformed has the idea of fitting into a mold. In other words, if you've ever made muffins, like I don't cook a lot, but I have made muffins. I have famous Diet Mountain Dew muffins that are off the chain. And so anytime I make them, I make this batter and I pour it into the muffin pan, which has little holes, and I pour it in there. And you know what it does? It takes the shape of the mold. He says that's what we do. When we are born, we're born sinners, and what we do is we do what the rest of the world does. We sin against God. We don't glorify him. That's the way we live our life. And so he says that's the way we're formed. And he says, so don't be conformed to that mold anymore. But he says, in other words, I want you to be transformed into a new way by renewing the way that you think, which will impact the way that you act every day. And so what he says is, I want you to be transformed, which simply in the Greek is a metamorphosis. That's literally the word in the Greek. There's a metamorphosis that takes place. Now, I don't know other places you use the word metamorphosis, but in science class. I look back at my life and go, when do I ever think about a metamorphosis? And I just remember there's this little worm called a caterpillar, makes a cocoon, and then what happens? Metamorphosis happens. The caterpillar becomes what? A butterfly. And like that ugly little worm, I'm not saying caterpillars are all ugly, but they're ugly and compared to the butterfly. And so they go in the cocoon, and then they come out. This beautiful butterfly has all these colors. They're just beautiful. They're flying around. We'll see them here in the spring. And guess what? It's a transformation. And what Paul is saying is, you and I, if we follow Christ and we view what he's done for us, we're going to have a transformation about how we think and how we respond and how we act and react to circumstances and people in our lives. That's what's going to happen. He says, so I want you to be transformed, and that's going to happen by changing the way that you think to think more like Jesus thinks, and then you'll know what the will of God is. In other words, the will of God, what pleases God, what brings a smile to God's face, what smells good to God, what makes God look good. When you follow Jesus, when you look at Jesus, you begin to see what that looks like. Because all you have to do to follow Jesus is look at what he did, what he said, and when you begin to embrace that and say, I want to live like that, you'll discover that you will do the things that please God. Because Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father do. In other words, so Jesus says, I only do what God does. So if you start doing what Jesus does, guess what you'll start doing? You'll do the things that God would do. And so that's where the transformation begins to take place. And so when Paul continues, we're not going to read it, but I challenge you to read it. In Romans 12, when you begin to read the rest of the text, it's all of these commands about how we should behave. And they look like Jesus. He begins to say, stop comparing yourself with everybody else. He begins to say things like, hey, when somebody does you wrong, don't take vengeance on them. Those are divergent. I mean, think about it. Somebody does you wrong, what do you want to do? I'll pay them suckers back. Somebody hurts you, I'm going to hurt them. And then Jesus comes along and says, love your enemies. And Paul comes along and echoes and says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So don't take vengeance on people. What does Jesus say to do when people do you wrong? You forgive them. Man, that's divergent. That's not the way the world operates. It's not being conformed, but being transformed. Now, we have D groups. They're discipleship groups, small groups. We'll be having a D group launch tonight. If you want to get in on it, you just come at 5 o'clock tonight. We'll fit you in, and we're going to be a part of that. We'd love for you to be out of your rows into some circles. We think that's important, and interact with people about the gospel. You don't have to be a Christian or a follower of Jesus to do that. You just need to come and be a part of that. But last semester, we did this book. It's called Love Does by Bob Goff. I mentioned it last week, and one of the things I want to go back to is You may not have read it, but you'll understand. And every time there's a chapter in his book, here's the kind of thing that he does. Hey, this is the title of the chapter, and then there's this little sentence, and it gets to the heart of Romans 12:2. He says this: I used to think I needed an office to be a lawyer, but now I know all I need is an island. Now, I'm not explaining what that is. You can read the chapter. But what I wanted to hit on is this. At the very beginning, he says, I used to think. And then he says, but now. When you get to the very next chapter, you find some of the same things. I used to think I had to act a certain way to follow God, but now I know God doesn't want us to be typical. Divergent. And then next chapter, I used to think being loved was the greatest thing to think about, but now I know love is never satisfied with just thinking about it. And so, in other words, every time you get to a chapter in this book, he says, I used to think, or I used to do, and then he says, but now I. And that's what I've discovered about following Jesus. The way that I used to think is being transformed to, but now I think. The way I used to do things is being transformed to, but now I do things this way. In other words, I used to do things like the world, but now I do things like Jesus. I used to think like the world thinks. If somebody hurts me, then I hurt them back. But now, because of what Jesus has done for me, he begins to transform. And that's what the gospel is about. That's what following Jesus is about. So, it helps us when we find some stories about these things. It's like, give me something I can hang on to. So what I want to do is I want to take you back to Mark chapter 10, into the Gospels. And here's one of the things that I've discovered in my time of studying the Word over the years, is that whatever doctrine or whatever value is given, so say like in a New Testament letter or command, you can go back into the Gospels and you can find stories about how Jesus lived that out. And one of the things that you discover when you do that is this is what it looks like to have a transformed mind. This is what it looks like to love your enemies. This is what it looks like to pray. So Jesus gives you those stories. The Gospels give you those stories. So I want to pick up with a story in Mark chapter 10. Now let me give you some context for where this story is so you won't be lost. Mark chapter 10 is getting toward the end of that gospel. It starts moving really fast. This is with Jesus, and Jesus had 12 guys that he chose to walk around with him for 3 years where he would train them. And so Jesus has these guys. There are 2 weeks or so from the time that Jesus is going to go and die on a cross for the sins of the world. They're about 2 weeks out. Matter of fact, they've been making their way from where they were doing their home-based ministry in Galilee down to Jerusalem, and they're on their way to go to Jerusalem where Jesus is going to be arrested and then eventually crucified. And as they're on their way, there's a conversation that strikes up. And Jesus begins to challenge their thought process because he wants to transform the way they've been thinking because they've been conformed. Even though for 3 years they've been walking around with Jesus, they have to have their thought process challenged. So here's what starts off in Mark chapter 10, verse 35. And James and John, who are 2 of the 12 disciples, they are the sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus, him, and said to him, Jesus, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. If you're a parent and your kid has ever come up to you and said those words, Dad, I want you to do for me whatever I ask of you, what is your first thought? He's up to something. She's up to something. So the 2 sons, James are brothers, James and John, come up to Jesus and said, we want to ask you to do something for us. One of the telltale signs of this is that they're missing the point with Jesus, is because their whole approaching him is for what? It's for their own benefit. In other words, they're coming to Jesus to say to him, we want you to do something for us, rather than the way that we probably should approach Jesus is saying to Jesus, what can we do for you? But they're saying, we want you to do something for us. And so Jesus is kind, and he doesn't rebuke them at that moment. He says, Verse 36, and he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? Like you do as a parent to your kids. So what do you want? And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. In other words, we believe that you are the Messiah. We believe that you're the King of Israel. We believe that you're going to overthrow Rome and you're going to set our people free. And when you get in your glory, when you're sitting on your throne, me and my brother, we want to be right there with you, buddy. We don't want your spot. We don't want to sit on your throne. But when you get there, we want to be second in command. James can be 1A, 1B. John can be, we're okay with 1A, 1B, one on your right and one on your left. That's what we want to do. Would you do that for us? We don't want to take your place. That's satanic. Satan wanted your place. We don't want your place. But when you get there, we want to be right there beside you. And so Jesus says to them, you don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drank, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am be baptized? And they said to him, we're able. And Jesus said that the cup that I drank, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those whom has been prepared. And so here's what Jesus says to them. He says, you guys think you're big enough to fill those roles? When he refers to the cup, he's referring to the cup that he's about to drink, which is God's wrath that's going to be poured out on him. And he's talking about the baptism that he's fixing to go under. In other words, he's going to be baptized with fire. He's fixing to go through a trial. And his question to them is, so you guys think y'all are big enough to handle it? And what was their response? Yeah, we can do that. We're able. We got your back. And then Jesus looks at them and said, oh, you're going to go through it. But I don't think you know what you're asking. And they did. James ended up being the first martyr. And John ended up being exiled to an island by himself. If you follow me, this is what you're going to go through. And you guys are going to follow me. But he says, it's not my place to put you in those places. That's the Father's place. And so he sobers them up a little bit. Now, let's just pause right there. I want to ask you a question. So there's Jesus, and then there's 12 guys. And you may have read further, but I don't want you to read further right now, so I want you to just hang with me for a second. If you're James and John, and you go to Jesus kind of behind the scenes, oh, Jesus, we want to talk to you. And then the other 10 guys hear about what you've just done, what do you think their response is going to be? I'll just ask you this because we're all conformed to the world. What would your response be? 12 guys following Jesus, and 2 of them get Jesus on the side and said, hey, when you get in your kingdom, can you make us 1A and 1B? What's your response? Yeah, who do they think they are? What are these 2 guys doing? So I want you, Mark writes this. He says, and when the 10 heard it, all 10, not just a few of them, but all of them, they began to be indignant at James and John. That's a way of saying they were hacked off at the other 2. How can you guys be sneaking around with Jesus trying to put yourself in a place above us? They were jealous and they were mad, probably because they didn't get to ask first. They wanted the spot. And so here's what Jesus did. And Jesus called them to him, and he said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. So what Jesus says is, boys, let's take it down a notch. He says, I want you to think about this, what you guys are doing. You're all mad at each other, all manipulating, all trying to get in first place. And he says, how the Gentiles do it. What's their leadership like? The Gentiles lord it over you. In other words, the Gentiles take place, and the Gentiles he would have been referring to are the Romans. The Romans were the one who had all the charge. They're the ones who had all authority. How did the Romans operate? They operated like this. I'm in charge and you're not. You're going to do what I say. You're here to help me. I'm not here to help you. That's how they operated. And so the whole way the world was operating was that everybody was in it for themselves. And so what were the disciples doing? They were like, we're in it for ourselves. If we don't grab ours right now, we might not get it. And so what Jesus says to them, how do they do it? How does the world do it? And he confronts them about their own anger. This is not just James and John, but all 12 of them get confronted. And here's what he says to them. But this is where divergence takes place. This is how the world does it, being conformed to the world, but this is not how we're going to do it. He says, it shall not be among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever will be first among you must be slave of all. And so what Jesus does is he calls them on the carpet about this, and he says, but it shall not be this way among my guys. We're not going to operate this way. This is not how we're going to do business. And he says, this is how we're going to make a change. And what's he doing? He's doing for them what Paul says. He says, you're not going to be conformed to leadership like the Gentiles, like the Romans, like the pagans, but you're going to have a new way of doing things. We're going to do different. We're going to break the mold. We're going to take the mold, and we're going to smash it, and we're going to do something brand new. He gives them a new vision for it. And what does he say? If you want to be great, then this is how you do it. You become a servant of everybody. If you want to be first, then you make yourself last, and you become a slave. Now, even in our culture, how does it affect you to hear that what Jesus is saying is that you should be a servant to everybody else and you should be a slave to other people? Let it land. We, just a couple of weeks ago, were part of the End It movement to end slavery. So we put X's on our hands. We joined that movement because we think slavery is not a good thing. We don't think slavery is God's plan for people. And so we want to see it ended. And there are more people in slavery today than ever in the history of the world. But we don't live like it. We don't think about it that way. But in our culture, even our culture, we have disdain for slavery. But the problem is Jesus saying, I want you to be a servant and a slave to people. Do you see how that's so divergent? He says, if you want to be great, then what you've got to do is make yourself a slave, make yourself a servant by putting other people first. Then he gives his own purpose statement. I want you to hear what he says. Verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In other words, this is Jesus beginning to talk to them about how they're going about their business. He says, for even I, Son of Man is a reference to Jesus that he's taken from Daniel, the writing of Daniel about the Son of Man being the Messiah. He says, oh, even the Messiah that you guys have been looking for to deliver you. He says, I'm him. I'm the guy. And I didn't come so you could serve me. I've come to serve you. That's radical. That's divergent. He says, I've come to serve you. The King of the universe, the one that everybody should bow down, the one that everybody should serve, says, for even I have come to serve you. And to give my life for you, to sacrifice my life for you. Question. Who is the greatest person to ever live on the face of the earth? And the resounding answer in this group should be Jesus. But if you don't believe he's the greatest person, I'll just offer you this. Our calendar is marked by the life of Jesus Christ coming to earth. That the calendar that you look at every day is marked by the fact that Jesus came. There's the time before he came and there's the time after he came. Nobody else in history has that mark in history but Jesus, because he is the greatest person to ever live. And what the greatest person who ever lived did was he became a servant for everybody. He was the king, the creator of all, but yet he came to serve. And so the question I began to ask, is it really true what Jesus said? If you want to be great, then you should become a servant. Is it really true that if you really want to be first, then you should be a slave? Do you really believe that? I mean, just think about the radical change that would take place in your life if you truly believe that. I'll tell you a story that I can't think captures why serving makes you great. Back in February of 2012, there's a guy named Chris Hearn. He is the CEO of Fountainhead Commercial Capital. He had to go on a business trip to California. And so he flew out to California. He sent his wife Shannon and their 2 kids, a son and a daughter, to the Ritz-Carlton over on Amelia Island. Some of you have been there. You vacationed there. Some of y'all might have plans to go there. It's not that far away. And so if you've ever been to a Ritz-Carlton, you know how nice it is. And if you've ever been to Ritz-Carlton, you know that one of the things that they do there is they serve. So Shannon and the 2 kids were there, and they left for Ritz-Carlton, went back home. Chris came back home to meet his family, and that very night that they all got back home, they noticed when they got back home their son was a little upset because he had left Joshy the giraffe at the Ritz-Carlton. Joshy the giraffe is his little stuffed animal. Now, I don't know if you've never been a parent, you might not get this, but if you've been a parent, you know this. Like in our family, our 3 boys had little pillows they carried around with them, and you don't want to leave those pillows anywhere. You know. So I don't know if yours was a stuffed animal, but if you've ever been to a hotel and left something, you know what usually happens to it. It's gone forever. And so it's a really big deal when your kid loses, Joshy the giraffe. So Chris got back home, and they're getting ready for bed, and he tells his son, he said, look, Joshy just wanted to stay at the Ritz-Carlton for a few extra days for more vacation. And so they contacted the Ritz-Carlton, and the loss prevention team of the Ritz-Carlton had found Joshy the giraffe. And so Chris didn't want to lie to his son, so he said, could you do me a huge favor? He said, could you take a picture of Joshy the giraffe on a lounge chair by the pool so that I could show him to say, Joshy, see, he's still at the Ritz-Carlton having a vacation. And so they did, and they sent it to him. And so Joshy the giraffe was chilling at Ritz-Carlton. Just a few days later, they get a box from the Ritz-Carlton at their house that has Joshy the giraffe in it. It also has pictures of Joshy the giraffe. It has a ID badge with Joshy Giraffe working at Ritz-Carlton. It has some Ritz-Carlton swag. And so they sent all these pictures of Joshy the giraffe. Here's some of the pictures that went out on social media. So you got the original picture with Joshy by the pool, chilling with his sunglasses. And then you got Joshy going down to the beach in the golf cart. You got Joshy hanging out at the spa getting a massage. And then you got Joshy learning how to work security at the Ritz-Carlton. And what they did is the people at Ritz-Carlton decided, hey, we're going to really serve this family. They were no longer at the Ritz-Carlton. But yet, these are people who think service is a big thing. And the story doesn't end there. So you got Joshy the giraffe. And it's about 3 or 4 years later. Joshy the giraffe, they go on a vacation or a soccer tournament down at in Jacksonville, and they're staying at the Residence Inn. And for somehow, the son loses Joshy the giraffe again at the hotel. And this time, they can't find him. And they turn the place over, and the wife, Shannon, keeps calling. But after a few days, they can't find Joshy the giraffe. And so Joshy's gone. A couple months later, they go back to the Ritz-Carlton. The daughter is hanging out, ends up having a conversation with one of the staff members. And by this time, Joshy's that story's kind of been popular. And so the daughter's talking to the staffer, finds out that Joshy's been lost. So a little later in that afternoon, there's a knock at their door. And I want to show you what they brought to the door of this family. Here's the next picture. This is Jeffy the giraffe, his long-lost cousin. And what they did is they cared enough about people to serve them. That's what service is about. You ever been to Ritz-Carlton? They are known for their service. It's considered one of the greatest hotels around. And you know why? Because they serve. Because what Jesus said is true. If you want to be great, then serve. Their motto at Ritz-Carlton is this: we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. Joshie the giraffe and Jeffy the giraffe are just what Jesus said. When he told the story of the Sermon on the Mount, he said, hey, when I want you to go the extra mile. You know what that means is if a Roman soldier by law come up to a Jew, they said, I want you to carry my bags. You were by law to carry that bag for a mile. And what he said is, I want my followers to do something exceptional. I want you to serve even more. I want you to carry it another mile. And that's when I started reading this article. You know what it said? The article began by saying, this is a company that goes the extra mile. They are known for their service, and it's what makes them great. You know what the number one fast food restaurant in the United States is? It's Chick-fil-A. You know why? It's not because they have the best food in the world, although I like their food and I think it's the best. But the reason they're number one, I heard this on sports talk radio the other day. They were talking about Chick-fil-A, and their whole point was the reason you go for Chick-fil-A, the number one reason is for the service, because service makes you great. What Jesus said is true. If you will serve, then you will find greatness. It is the reason why he is the greatest person to ever live, because he is the greatest servant to ever live. And that's what we should be. People who are willing to serve. You know what? When that whole thing with Joshie came to fruition, everybody began to hear about this story. Like in the very beginning of this story, it hit social media. There were 12,000 Facebook likes about Joshie the giraffe. There were over 4,000 tweets about it. There were over 3,500 shares about Joshie the giraffe. That's what makes Ritz-Carlton great, because their motto is, we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. What that is basically the gospel. They see themselves as ladies and gentlemen, just like we should see ourselves as people loved by God through Jesus Christ. And so therefore, because they see themselves as ladies and gentlemen, they see others as ladies and gentlemen, so they serve them just like they would want to be served. That, my friends, is the gospel. That we have been loved by God, so we love people. We put it out on Facebook this week. Save people, serve people. Because if we follow Jesus, the person, and he was great by serving people, then what should we be known for? Serving people, helping people, loving people. This is the vision. So, I used to think that being served was the goal. But now I think serving is the goal. I used to think like the world, but now I think like Jesus. Imagine, what if the world that we live in, everybody decided to serve one another? Imagine Coffee County if everybody decided to serve one another. Imagine Grace Point, where everybody here was willing to serve somebody, to push aside what they wanted for somebody else. The Apostle Paul echoed this because he saw this in the life of Jesus. I want to read to you Philippians 2, verse 3. This is what the heart of it is. He captures it in a sentence. He says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourself. You become a servant when you begin to say, it's not about me, and it's not about me being served, and you drop your pride and you say, but in humility, I'm going to be divergent. I'm going to consider other people better than me. That's what we're called to. That's what Jesus did. He laid down his life. He served. Quick story, John chapter 13. This is the last week of Jesus' life. That's conversation next to last week where the conversation takes place with his disciples. The night before he goes to the cross to die, this is what happens in John 13. Jesus gets them in a room. We call it the Last Supper. And in that room, he has a conversation with them about how they're supposed to do business in this world. And so what Jesus does is he takes off his robe and he lays it down to the side, and then he comes to his disciples and he makes himself a slave. When you would go to dinner with Jesus, or in that day, in Jesus' day, what you would do is you would first come in and there would be a servant or a slave to wash your feet. Because you laid down at the table, you reclined at the table on your left arm and your feet stuck out. Now, anybody knows you don't want to see people's feet when you're eating. You know, grocery store feet, follow me? And so what you would do is you get your feet washed, and the person who washed the feet were always the person who was a slave. So Jesus on this night laid down his robe, and he started to wash the disciples' feet. And the disciples were like, you're not going to do that. And he said, yeah, I'm going to do this. And he tells them, I'm doing this so you can learn a lesson. And so he washes all the disciples' feet. And then he says to them, John 13, 14, and 15, these words, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. What did Jesus do? Jesus became a servant to them. He didn't just say to do this, he actually did this. And so what he's saying to them is the same thing he's saying to us. So if Jesus did this for me, then what should I do? Then I should serve other people. He didn't just say it, but he actually did it. And he did it so we would have a model to follow. This morning, the application is just simple. Who in your life do you need to consider better than yourself? And who in your life and in your world can you serve? Can you help? If everybody at Grace Point would take that position, we would begin to think like that and act like that. I promise you, we'll make an impact on our community. We'll make God look good, and we'll make God smile at the same time. That's our hope. Imagine Coffee County, where everybody in the county thought about others before they thought about themselves. That's what